No one knocked on my door that late. My town was the kind of place where doors stayed shut after 10, porch lights dimmed, and the only sound past midnight was the river through the trees and the occasional old truck on Route 5. I had my routines. Coffee at 6, a $20 thermos in the van, a stack of vinyl on the shelf I only let myself play on Sundays. I fixed what people brought me. Washers that shuddered like old men, stoves that forgot how to heat, fridges that decided to sleep through summers. I liked the predictability of it. You could take something apart, find the problem, put it back together, and the house would hum again. People appreciated that. It kept my hands busy and my head quiet. That night, the porch light clicked on because of the knock. I was halfway through a repair manual at the kitchen table, a chrysanthemum in a chipped mug beside me where I'd poured my third cup of coffee. The smell of wet wool from the scarf draped over the chair mixed with the lotion on my palms from wrenching a stubborn valve. The knock was not frantic, but it wasn't polite either. More like someone had rehearsed urgency and found their voice. I remember thinking, absurdly, that whoever it was probably had gum on their shoe. When I opened the door, the light from across the street threw half of her face into shadow. Julia stood there with her hands stuffed into the pockets of an old coat, the wool collar bunched up around her neck like armor. Her hair was damp from the chill that had come through the evening, and there were tears on her cheeks. But she wasn't crying like a movie cry. It was quieter, like rain coming through a leaky gutter. "Mark," she said, my name sounding strange on her lips. She was my neighbor 2 doors down, the woman with the porch swing and the gardens that never quite followed the season. The sort of person who waved when you passed by and brought banana bread to the block party, even if she was the one still grieving. Grief sits in people like a second breath sometimes. I'd seen it in her before, in small things. Her hand lingering on a photograph at the thrift store, the way she would fold her hands over the gaps in the porch swing. But that night it held a new set of edges. "Can I come in?" she asked. She didn't wait for me to answer. She stepped inside like someone who had practiced being small in other people's rooms. The smell of the street came with her, wet leaves and the faint copper of old railings. She dropped a damp scarf over the back of a chair as if she had always belonged here. I brewed more coffee because that was what you do. We sat at the table with the dishwasher manual still open, the page held down by my toolbox. She didn't start with sentences that fit together neatly. Instead, she told me in fragments, about a car veering across a median, about a night that didn't belong to her anymore, about 2 people who would never come back. She used names when she could, and when she didn't, she let silence name them for her. I had known broadly the tragedy, who didn't in a town like ours, but the particulars are private things. You learn to let them be private because private is where people carry their best and worst selves. I listened because she was asking me to. Then she asked me the thing I had no frame for. She looked at me, really looked at me, and asked a favor that was too large to be polite. "I need someone to be a father to my child," she said. The words landed like a dropped wrench. She wasn't asking for money or help with paperwork. She wasn't asking me to stand in as a name. She was asking me to be someone, somebody that I had never planned to be. I remember going quiet. I remember the ductwork of my life, the neat boxes it was packed into, and how that question tipped them. A part of me had always assumed I would be someone who fixed things for others, but not someone who would be held responsible for a life in that way. I was 29, good at replacing belts and tightening loose bolts, still with the same flannel shirts in the same closet. The idea of a child to care for didn't fit into the margins of my days. She told me why she thought of me. It wasn't heroic, it was neighborly. She trusted that I'd come when she knocked on the door. She trusted that I would show up and that I was a person who tethered to the ordinary. That meant something to her. And because I heard the tremor in her voice, because the scarf in my hand smelled like rain and desperation, I heard the end of what she'd said, even when she didn't finish the sentence. "I can't do this alone," she said. "Not now." I closed the door on the night like you close a book you don't want to read. She left with the scarf trailing off my porch like an unfinished thought. For a long time I stood there, the hallway light pooling at my feet, and felt the knock reverberate through the bones of the house. My hands were still stained with grease. I had never been the sort of person who would fill a silence with promises, and I made none that night. But her question lodged like a sliver under skin I didn't know I had. If you want to hear how a single knock changed everything, stay with me. The first days after that, my routine dissolved into small, awkward rituals. Coffee tasted like the mug it sat in, bitter and ordinary, as if my mouth couldn't hold anything more complex. I drove my van without music, parked near houses I used to pass by without a second thought. I would stop by the hardware store to pick up a part, and stand near the display of baby-proofing latches, as if the box held instruction manuals for people who had never been parents. I called my sister Martha because she is the sort of person who says the things you're too proud to say to yourself. Martha lived in the next town over. She kept a garden larger than her patience, and a voice that could cut through any pretense. When I told her about the knock, there was a long pause on the other line. Then she asked the question that made the situation less easy to keep inside my chest. "Do you want to be a father?" she asked. It's a direct question, the kind that strips conversation back to bone. I told her the truth. I didn't know. I said I was afraid of doing it wrong, of being a person who offered pity instead of presence, of making someone who needed steadiness into a project. She listened the way people who love you do, quietly, without pretending to fix it. Then she said, "Pity's easy. Love is harder. But loving is a choice, Mark. You don't have to feel ready to choose." Martha made me see the difference between obligation and choosing. I thought of the repairs I did, how I didn't work out of duty but because something in me loved the steadying of parts, the way a machine that had been wobbly found its rhythm again. If love was a kind of work, maybe it wasn't a feeling I needed to wait for so much as a thing I could begin to practice. Still, the fear lived under my ribs. Fear of failing someone, fear of not being enough, fear of stepping into something that would hollow me out in ways I'd never imagined. I started showing up in small ways. At first it was practical. Soup on her doorstep the first week when the days were still shallow with November light, a bag of repairs and a spare part when her washing machine gave up. Then it was things that mattered more. Taking apart a fussy dryer in her basement as we talked about music and the way the neighborhood had changed, returning a vinyl she had left at my house and laughing at the crackle it made when we put it on the player. There were moments of awkwardness. I embarrassed myself more than once by asking the wrong question or staying too long. Sometimes we sat on her porch swing long after the light had gone, and the sound of the town was a low hum around us. She asked me to be honest with her. No folding the truth into a shape meant to comfort. "If you can't do this because you're afraid," she said once, looking at me with a steadiness that could have been carved from the porch rail, "then tell me now. I don't want plans built on pity." I told her the truth. "I'm scared," I said. "I don't know if I'm what you need." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and it was less of a comfort than an agreement. "Then choose it," she said. "Not because you feel heroic, but because you want to be present. Be practical, be honest, be there." That was the line that shifted things for me. I'm not normally dramatic. Moments of decision for me are often quiet and domestic rather than cinematic. But that night, with the mug steam fogging the window and the chrysanthemums looking a little tired in the cooler air, I said, "I choose you." It was as small and as big as that. It was not a rescue. It wasn't a promise to fix everything. It was a statement of intention. I would show up. I would try. From there, the work began in the practical, prosaic ways of ordinary life. We saw a doctor together, sat in the waiting room with magazines that still smelled of someone else's hands. We talked about what being parents would mean in our economy and our world, the baby-proofing, the sleep arrangements, the names. We laughed at our own untidiness, at the idea that two people who sometimes forgot to water plants could manage the life of another human. We planned in the way people who are scared try to make things less scary, by turning the future into a list. The pregnancy revealed itself like a private miracle that refused to be theatrical. The test sat on the bathroom counter in the cool light. its result a small, unmistakable pair of lines. I remember what it felt like to look at it. My hands were steady, but my breath wasn't. She clutched my wrist the way someone might for balance on a ship. We laughed, which sounded ridiculous in that stark, tiled room. We cried, quietly, turning our faces into the corner of the wall where wallpaper met plaster. There was no crescendo of music or triumphant shout, just the slow realization that a life was beginning, because two people, in a small town by a river, decided to let it happen. The months that followed were full of little ceremonies. We painted a small room in the back of her house the soft green of spring, the color of new stems. We hung a mobile above a crib that looked too big for such a small beginning. I patched holes in the nursery wall where the previous tenants had left their own histories, and I found myself thinking about mending not as a mechanic's work, but as a life skill, smoothing edges, sanding rough spots, applying a steady hand. Julia gathered quilts and knitted caps. Sometimes in the middle of the night I'd wake to the sound of her at the kitchen sink, hands in warm water, humming to a record I didn't recognize. It became clear that we were building more than a room. We were building a rhythm. There were fears that visited like uncomfortable guests. I had trouble sleeping on nights when the wind came down hard, imagining accidents and losses. I wondered about whether my decision was right, whether it was generous or selfish. There were moments when grief surfaced in small, sharp ways, an empty chair in a photograph, a holiday ritual skipped, and I had to learn restraint, how to hold the quiet without offering platitudes. I learned how to respect the people who were no longer there by honoring the way Julia spoke of them sometimes, letting their memory be present without letting it define the whole of what was to come. At the ultrasound, we watched a screen that looked like white clouds and black ocean. The doctor was kindly and practical, explaining as he went along. The baby's heartbeat was a steady, miniaturized drum. Standing there in the dim room, my hand on Julia's back, the world outside the window looked like a postcard, the cherry trees freckled with early leaves, the street calm and indifferent. The reality of what we were doing, the literalness of a body growing inside another, made the choice feel less theoretical. It became a sequence of facts, appointments, vitamins, the tap-tap of a little foot. We talked about names and landed on one that felt like the right shape for this small life. Liam. It was short and light in the mouth, sturdy enough for a boy who would play in the yard, and sensitive enough for nights awake. It sounded like things I could say in the dark. Labor came with the low, focused noise of a storm. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and coffee. The room was small, curtained, and the light outside was the kind that looked like cold milk. I called Martha and told her to meet me at the hospital, because sisters are the people who can hold you up when your hands forget how. The contractions were long and patient, the staff efficient in that particular hush they have for people on the edge of change. When the birth happened, I stood at the edge of the bed in a way I had stood at so many appliances, attentive, hands ready, trying not to do anything reckless. Julia's face was an atlas of concentration and love. The baby cried, a bright, immediate sound that rearranged something in my chest. The nurse, gentle, practiced, placed him briefly on Julia's chest, and then handed him to me. He was smaller than I imagined. He smelled like warm milk and the soft cleft of infancy. His fingers were a fraction of my own and already surprisingly strong. He curled around one of my fingers without fanfare, like a creature that knew where to grip to anchor itself to the world. I remember the astonishment of it, how small his hand was against my thumb, how the world could be reduced to the scale of that grip. A nurse smiled and said something about how babies have a way of picking people, that sometimes you don't need a certificate to be a parent, just to be present. Julia, exhausted, laughed low and hoarse and said, "Call him Liam." She folded into the bed and looked at me with a softness that was a kind of surrender. Then, quieter almost to the baby himself, she said, "He's your dad, Liam." There was no fanfare, no label from a certificate, just the ordinary act of naming and claiming that makes families. In that moment, with the hospital light on my shoulder and the small body breathing against my chest, I felt something inside me rearrange. It wasn't that all my old doubts evaporated. I still had the same fears, but they sat in a different place, softened around the edges by the weight of the child. I was not, in any legal sense that mattered, the man whose name the baby would carry on a birth certificate. At least not yet. I wasn't the father he would biologically inherit from anyone, but the way he fit his fist into my hand felt like an invitation, not a claim. He had chosen to hold on. That was as honest and as complete as any title. Months after the birth, in the slow movements of new parenthood, bottles on the counter, the hush of a stolen nap, the way laundry folds into the rhythm of the week, Liam began to become part of what the house meant. We measured him against the backs of chairs and the door frames. We watched him discover the world, the way he found the music when we put on records, the way his small feet liked the cold of the porch floorboards. He learned to mimic the clicks of my toolbox, stacking plastic rings as if they were bearings and pulleys. There were hard nights, of course. There were mornings when I'd find myself awake at 3, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until the day shifted. There were times when grief came knocking like a neighbor late at night, and we would both fold our hands around our tea mugs and let the memory be what it was. But there were all the other things, too. The way Liam nuzzled into my neck when he was sleepy, the way he laughed when I pretended to misplace my wrench, the way he would pat my cheek with a tiny hand as if to say, "You're okay." At some point, shortly after his first birthday, I think, it happened in a way that was both small and enormous. We were in the garden, the chrysanthemums we'd planted that fall finally blooming in stubborn, late-season colors. Liam was perched in his little chair, a smear of pear on his chin, and he looked up at me with eyes like little brown moons. "Da," he said, a sound that stumbled out of him like a rehearsal, and then again, clearer, "Dad." And the word landed and settled like a hand on my heart. For a second I didn't know whether I could breathe. Julia smiled and cried at once, that way people do when everything they've been carrying becomes visible. Martha, who had come over to help with the yard and who had watched all the small decisions and the slow days, wrapped her scarf tighter and said something that made me laugh through the lump in my throat. There was no ceremony. It wasn't a legal declaration or a showy moment. It was the ordinary, undeniable thing of a child putting a name to the person who had kept him through nights and mornings, and scraped knees. He had called me Dad. Being called that didn't erase the absence that had come before. There are people who aren't here, and we kept them in our quiet ways, on certain holidays, in the stories told softly over pie, in the empty chair by the tree. Grief remained a presence that we honored, but underneath it, there was an accumulation of small days where someone needed you and you showed up. There was the steadying work of mending a life, not a single act of salvation but 1,000 small acts. Latching a car seat, reading the same story until the words lost meaning, humming that one children's song off-key. I used to think my hands knew only how to fix things that were broken in the ways machines are broken. A snapped belt, a frayed wire. I learned they were good at other repairs too, putting a bandage on a scraped knee, coaxing a grown woman's laughter out when she'd forgotten it could be loud, building a bookshelf and placing a photograph of a family that had once been, and one that was forming beside one another. Love, I discovered, is like replacing a gasket. You don't force it. You fit it carefully and make sure it's seated right, and then you test it by turning the machine on again. The machine hums, sometimes with a new sound, sometimes a little differently than before, but it hums. We settled into the new rhythm. The porch light came on at dusk and there was a small chorus of neighborhood voices. Neighbors with their own histories, walking by, giving a nod. The porch swing creaked in a language of its own as we watched Liam sleep, his chest rising and falling. I would repair a dryer and hang a baby blanket over the line to air dry, the cloth fluttering like a flag of an odd, fragile victory. People asked how I handled it, as if there had to be a pivot point where I explained myself. The truest answers I could give were simple. I showed up, I tried, I listened. Sometimes late at night when Liam would wake and cry for reasons only a child and a parent could understand, I would take him into the kitchen and we would stand under the soft hum of the refrigerator light. The house would be quiet, the chrysanthemum petals closing like tiny fists. I would rock him and think about the knock that started it all. How one moment of need led me into a life I hadn't planned for. It wasn't a rescue story in which I saved someone from the abyss. It was two people who found in each other the willingness to begin again. There are days when being dad is messy. There are papers to sign, taxes to file, tears to dry. There are dinners burnt and arguments about naps and the small, stubborn difficulties of communicating in the middle of exhaustion. But there are also mornings when Liam wakes up smiling and reaches for me, as if there's nowhere else he could go. There are evenings when Julia folds into my arm and says quietly, "You gave me and him a home." And sometimes, in my repair van with a lullaby on the radio and a spare bolt in the tray, I find myself smiling at how far the simple act of being present can push a life. If this moved you, please like or share, and tell us in the comments about someone who gave you a second chance. I wasn't his father by blood when I first held him. I was a neighbor who knocked back the quiet and, on a strange November night, answered. He called me Dad before I had fully unlearned all the safety nets I kept around my heart. The word settled me like a bolt tightened to the right torque. It didn't fix everything, grief still lived in the corners, but it did something quieter and truer. It gave me a place to stand when the world tried to make me smaller. It taught me that some things you build one small day at a time, and that the hands you thought were only for tools can be hands that hold.